so observed. I'm speaking on behalf of the UN system in Namibia. And I think we always say, as the UN, we are grateful to be welcome in the Namibian household. We always say we are here because you invite us to come here. So thank you once again for the opportunity to come and literally share a little bit of some of the value that the UN system offers here within the country. I'm speaking, of course, on behalf of our principal, Madam Popular Pororo, on the topic at hand, which is paper number 3, on governance, policy and institutions, the coordination aspect of economic development. This was a head scratcher for us, but also an opportunity, because there's a number of concepts that are in this one particular query that we provided with. And it's really wonderful to see some ministries here that speak to some of the work that has to do with these concepts. So what am I going to focus on? I'll talk a little bit about definitions, defining governance. I think what we have realized is governance is a word that we tend to use a lot, and also institutions is another word, a concept we use a lot. But sometimes if we understand the meaning of these concepts, we can better internalize and then channel sort of our strategies and interventions. I'll talk a little bit about the stylized rights. My sister, Eunice Ajambo, talked a little bit about them, but I'll talk a bit about them in a manner that makes the UN system reflect on the support that we are offering, and sort of the need for us to do more. I'll talk a little bit about development planning, the SDGs, and the Agenda 2063 of the Africa we want, because sectors such as tourism and agriculture sort of have a transboundary element to them. And we know that Namibia is a small open economy, so we cannot talk about Namibia in a vacuum. And given some of the opportunities regionally, we need to open up our thinking when it comes to planning for the country. And then, of course, the opportunities for rural transformation, and then the conclusions, because there were specific asks from us as the system. So, governance, we all use the concept. However, there are many diverse definitions of it. I came up with a few of them, and you can see every year they change. There's a different author or researcher that comes up with a new one. But what does that mean for us as the UN system? We do have a definition of governance. It is a process whereby public institutions conduct public affairs and manage public resources in a manner that promotes the rule of law and the realization of human rights. So you can see that the definition of governance all of a sudden has expanded. It's no longer about the role of the Ministry of Justice. It's no longer about the role of the courts. It's not just a legal concept. It actually has some rights and obligations related to it. It has public financial management, it has economic governance, and it includes all of these other elements that are important when it comes to development planning. So the UN's definition is more expansive, which again helps in the conceptualization of interventions that are required for rural transformation. And then what's the link between governance and institutions? So institutions are mechanisms through which we govern. They're the rules of the game, they determine incentives. The more we exclude people, it means that our institutions are weak. When we leave people behind, it means our institutions are weak. You can have a piece of paper, you can have a policy, but if the human interaction is weak, if the incentives are not equally shared, if voices of others are not present, that institution is weak. And so, we were asked as the UN system to talk a little bit about the decentralization policy. We consider it an institution. So then the question is, what has been the verdict on the decentralization policy as an institution, given the demands of what an institution should be? I leave that question open for your own response. But the takeaway here is that the decentralization policy is an institution, and it is a mechanism through which governance can happen. So with the Ministry of Urban Planning, you have that policy as an instrument for governing. And then we were asked a little bit about data. And this is the other thing, which is when you think about governance, you think about the normative, the legalistic definition of governance. But we have advanced the conversations. We are measuring governance. We are putting numbers on governance. We are putting numbers on governance indicators. I'm using data from the Ibrahim Index of African Governance. We think that comparability of data is important. Again, not looking at Namibia in a vacuum, but as a whole within the region of Africa and also the globe at large. So we hear in meetings and in workshops, Namibia has strong institutions. And if you look at the rankings, even within the continent, Namibia is together with Mauritius, Seychelles, the other upper middle income country. But when you disaggregate the data, this is some of what we find. There's more variables, but I thought just to take out a few of them, you can see that the picture is mixed, right, on governance, right? So you have, for example, political power and representation of women over the last 10 years, very strong. I think my colleague from ILO queried, where's the face of women? So Namibia actually does very well when it comes to female representation. However, when it comes to aspects such as property rights, my sister Emma talked about land as sort of important for rural transformation. But the aspect of property rights is actually in the negative in this country. And all the others, for example, promotion of environmental sustainability. That's the largest on this side, on the negative. So and I think Madam Emma Mayer talked about conservancies. But if you look at the data, the governance indicator on environmental sustainability, it's on the negative. So when you're making sort of policy interventions, it helps to ask the question, why is this variable to that extent? But I think we also talked about the importance of digital ICT, and we can see significantly positive. Mobile communications over the past 10 years have been rising in Namibia. Also, administration is on the positive. The transport network is a little bit not that strong. Again, going back to the point that was made about the need for infrastructure within the rural areas. So basically, the value of this slide is that it just shows that the picture of governance is mixed. And when you're making policy intervention, it's better to dig a little bit deeper in some of these variables based on data in order to come up with something that shows the true picture of what's going on. The other query we had was to talk a little bit about data. And of course, this is about the rural economy. Again, from the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, I'm sorry to showcase that, unfortunately, under rural economy, we don't have data from Namibia, you see. So these are some of the issues whereby we're saying poverty is in the rural areas, unemployment, informality, but we don't have data on rural land and water access, rural market access, rural economy support, rural representation and participation. So this is a call. It means that we have some work to do, maybe to provide this data, and then come 2030, when Vision 2030 is being evaluated, we can say a little bit about what's happening on the rural economy. The rural economy, Again, numbers, data. We have the stories, but the numbers tell an interesting picture. This was fascinating to me. If you look at the population distribution, it's almost the same. The rural areas and the urban areas, it's almost 50-50, a million, right? So that's an interesting story, which then begs the question, why are some people being left behind? If it's 50-50 in the rurals and the urban, why these major differences? The data is showing some the discrepancies, again, on economic development. The household size, we see the dependency is higher in rural areas, about 5 to 3 people in each household. Rural areas have lower disposable income. And for us, the value for numbers in the UN is it helps us make the case, the justification, to tell the story without thinking about anecdotal information. You can see that rural areas are spending almost 60% of their income on food, right? And then 40% of it, the next high one is housing. The governor talked about the silver houses. So if an estimated 20% of income in rural areas is on silver houses, then how much is that costing these rural areas? Does it actually mean that people in rural areas are paying a lot of money for silver houses because their disposable income, the next high of it, is on housing? So why is the quality of housing then not to par? But the disturbing one, again speaking to the relevance of strengthening the agriculture sector, is this 60% that is spent on food. So basically, rural households are just surviving. The money they get is to get food. Quite problematic when you're thinking about enablers for economic development. We can talk about skills, but you cannot go to a class with an empty stomach. And then, again, this is another justification for the agriculture sector, right? For strengthening it, which is actually the majority of the income. That little income that we saw is coming from that sector. And that's what the numbers are showing, that that sector, if developed, indeed, it might make a dent in the economic development in rural areas, because that's where the majority of the income is coming from. I see the minister from the Lyric is here, Madam Yatoigu. We are working, and my brothers and sisters from Bonn, we are working on the Global Accelerator. So it's about jobs. And I was sharing with Madam Yatoigu that giving the UN the task to think about this is, we were not actually thinking strongly about the rural economy as a part of the Global Accelerator. And this is, again, very telling, which is, we were talking about informality and employment in Namibia. And that's the thing about data that we are talking about. When we, even us, when we say the unemployment rate in Namibia is 33%, we haven't been disaggregating that data, right? So we looked at it as a whole. But when you disaggregate, then you realize that there has to be need to target the rural areas, and perhaps if we do target the rural areas, that's where we're going to start seeing changes in the inequality, in the unemployment, and in the poverty rates. Again, the point of informality, and this discrepancy is even so much higher. We have been talking about informality and we think Kaputura, right? But maybe we need to think even further and find out where these discrepancies in informality, what it tells us and where our focus really needs to be. And then, of course, the labor force participation. We learned from my colleague from ILO about the labor, sort of the nature of the labor force in the agriculture sector in the rural areas, and the issues around that. So this discrepancy is not that big, But again, the devil is in the details, which is if majority are employed in agriculture, what is going on in that sector when it comes to their rights? And this was a bit disturbing, because in the UN we have this principle called leaving no one behind. So we are leaving rural people behind, but we are leaving the most vulnerable even behind. We see that these households are being headed by children. They're being headed by persons with disabilities, by the elderly. So it is a complex picture. It's not just about now saying rural areas, it's asking who in the rural areas. So we then were asked to talk a little bit about the decentralization policy. We think that devolution supports sort of the delivery of services. The closer you are to the people, the more you understand them, the more you know them, and hopefully the more you can provide them with the services. So we learned about the decentralization policy, and then we read a little bit about the status of that policy. And the verdict, unfortunately, is that perhaps we have not really utilized that policy to the extent to which it is supposed to be utilized, and as such, maybe we have not optimized outcomes from it. And so, if the services are not closer to the people, then we are not doing our part in sort of advancing economic development. And unfortunately, the outcomes paint that picture. For example, the technology numbers, right? You can see again, rural, urban, the differences in who owns a phone, who owns a smartphone, who owns a computer, right? So when we kind of, again, service delivery is a part of governance, right? So if we are not closer to the people, these are some of the outcomes that come up. There's this difference in people who own phones and those who don't within the urban and the rural. The education is also disproportionate, right? And these are some of the enablers for economic development, some of the inputs, right? So again, when we are not close to the people, these are some of the results that we get. And then the spatial differences. Again, the silver houses. You can see, again, in housing, we saw that a lot of the food and housing is where majority of the funds or the income for rural areas go. But the quality of housing is a problem. So it's sort of a catch-22. You're spending a lot of your money on housing, but then you don't even get good quality housing. And housing is a human right, by the way. And then the energy shortage. I think we had a lot about electricity accessibility. The numbers, again, also showed. I mean, agriculture, now we're talking about it, smart agriculture and modernization. It's not just about holes, right? So you need energy for irrigation, you need energy for motoring your tools. So even if we are going to promote agriculture in the rural areas, they're going to need the energy to make that modern. Healthcare access. Again, you can be trained in skills, but if you're not a healthy person, that development intervention is not sustainable. Resources will be used by the government to educate you, and if you're ill and you're not there anymore, that's sort of a waste of resource. So healthcare contributes to human capital, just like education. And then there's some words we are interchanging, and which was also a moment of reflection for us. There's economic development, and then there's rural transformation. So we think that we have talked a lot about economic development in its various facets. And to advance a bit the agenda on economic development in rural areas, we need rural transformation. So So it's not rural economic development, but it's rural transformation. And rightly so, right? The topic of the symposium today. So the goal, well, our recommendation is when we leave the room, is we think more about rural transformation instead of rural economic development. Because rural transformation then allows us to develop a strategy of intervention. You can see the definition. It's basically a change where rural societies diversify their economies, reduce reliance on agriculture, become dependent on trade and goods, and basically it's a process of structural transformation. It's looking at the rural sector in a manner that sort of enables economic transformation. And a point was made about different regions have different comparative advantages. That's also in this slide. So you look beyond agriculture and you ask yourself, what does what you're going to have to offer as a comparative advantage, right? Maybe not agriculture, maybe agriculture. What does the Romo have to offer, right? So that's how you start thinking in rural transformation. You think about economic diversification, which is another concept that we are advancing in Namibia, which is how can we diversify the economy? So the concept of rural transformation allows us to think about economic diversification and also to leverage the comparative advantages of the different areas. And of course, this was saying the agri-food sector, the local drivers moving away from agriculture, thinking beyond agriculture, and then about the larger value chain for the rural areas. And I think innately we are used to hearing rural areas and hearing agriculture. But maybe rural areas have other economic activities that they can contribute. Of course, it's the when we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is sort of where we anchor the support, which is the Agenda on Rural Transformation contributes to this range of SDGs 1, 2, 4, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, and 17. But more importantly, the Agenda for Rural Transformation is also anchored in the AU's Agenda 2063 of the Africa Movement. There is the CARA, which is the Comprehensive Agriculture Development Program for Africa. The beauty of CARA is that it actually has governance principles enshrined into it, right? Talks about African ownership and leadership, accountability and transparency and inclusiveness, evidence-based planning and decision-making, the regional complementarities, right? If we advance the agriculture sector in Namibia, say livestock, Namibia probably won't be able to consume all of those products. We may need to export some to Ghana, right? So you need to have a regional perspective when it comes to the agriculture sector, because maybe you have a surplus, and maybe there's a demand continentally for those agricultural products. So again, this whole point of extending the thinking and the conversation. So as we think about the support of the UN, we also think about the value added of the thinking that's happening in the African Union. And the other story is actually African Union and AU, there are similarities in what we are trying to advocate. So we complement each other. So these are the questions we were asked to ponder. Who should participate in the design of policies for rural economic development? The role of monitoring and evaluation, and then administrative capacity and technical assistance. So data, the decentralization policy, and the design. First, we wanted to talk about the opportunities. We still think the decentralization policy is an opportunity, and it's good that it's going to be reviewed. But it should be reviewed with economic transformation and structured transformation in mind. So bring economic development into the decentralization policy. And then this point was made earlier about the differences within the different regions. Again, given how vast Namibia is, within the UN we have this concept called area-based programming. So it's similar to the concept that Dr. Ajambo mentioned about South Korea, the village. So given the vastness of the country, there's value in thinking about specific areas and then deciding on what the intervention should be for them. This point of natural resources governance, for us, for Namibia, is an important one. Agriculture will be dependent on natural resources, whether it's land, whether it's whatever it is. So we think that in that rural sort of development strategy, maybe also think about a natural resources governance strategy, right? So that it's not just about economics, but those frameworks that Dr. Ajambo talked about. But they narrow down to the resources aspect of it. The enablers, technology, entrepreneurship, research and development are all opportunities. And more importantly, within our work, we have this concept called a human rights-based economy. We find that when we dwell only and mostly on economics, we are leaving people behind. But when we think about economic sort of organization, from a human rights perspective, and we saw already people in rural areas are left behind, then perhaps that can guide our thinking on strengthening or further developing the rural sector. So to the questions, in the design, we are suggesting and highly recommending a rural transformation strategy, not just a policy, but a strategy. Because a strategy comes with an action plan. And you need resources allocation and you hold people accountable. So get beyond an act, get beyond the policy, think about an actionable strategy. And for that strategy to also be informed by coordinated participatory development planning. Minister of Urban and Rural Development, you would have a key role. We also have mentioned agriculture. Again, agriculture is coming up. So in the development of that strategy, you can't leave these ministries out. And then the planning commission, and of course the dot, because you decide who other players will be involved in sort of the development of the strategy. Of course, the land reform issue needs to be front, right, and center in that strategy. And then value chains development. CFTA is an opportunity for Namibia. If we are developing agriculture, we need to think about opportunities for export. So look at regional integration as an opportunity to advance the rural sector. The question of data statistics, unfortunately, there's not a lot of good news there. There's need for data. And if you look at the last sentence, you can see, I was sad to include Namibia on this list of countries where data on the rural economy is sort of lacking. So hopefully we can change that. And then administrative capacity. SDG number 17 is about the means of implementation of the SDGs. There's financing, capacity development, technology. So what that means is basically the United Nations is welcoming the government to invite us to contribute to sort of this need for capacity and technical assistance. Already our colleagues from ILO are in the room, but we are a big organization. We have FAO, WFP, Red Cross, so we are inviting you to rely on us. We encourage South-South cooperation, absolutely, especially when it comes to rural transformation. My sister mentioned South Korea, but there's also China. I think China is the story where how can you lift 800 million people out of poverty? That, I think about it and I wonder about it. So who better to go and learn from? So through South-South cooperation, we think that Namibia can benefit significantly from sort of rural economic development and rural transformation. And already that's happening, so kudos. So UN support, and the beauty of the rural transformation is that it includes all these dimensions of sustainable development: the social, the economic, and the environmental, right? So if Namibia does well on this, imagine the difference we'll be making in poverty, inequality, and unemployment. The story speaks for itself. And all of our SDGs are there, and the rural are feeding into those SDGs. So as the United Nations, this is interesting for us. Then those are just a few references, and to thank you for the opportunity, but just to say we are here, thank you for always having us in your house.